Hello, and welcome back to Emovura Audio Books. Thank you for spending this hour with us. A quick note before we begin. Tonight's story is a work of fiction. Every name, every place, every detail has been invented for storytelling purposes, and any resemblance to real people or real events is entirely coincidental. Tonight's story is called The Man Nobody Claimed, and unlike some of the stories we've told on this channel, this one isn't really about a crime in the way you might expect. There's no chase, no dramatic arrest, no courtroom scene at the end. What there is, instead, is a mystery that took more than 60 years to even partially solve. A man with no name, a scrap of paper with 2 words on it, and a secret that outlived almost everyone who might have explained it. Part 1. A Man on the Sand. Picture Sumner Beach on a mild December evening. One of those long, golden Christchurch evenings where the light seems reluctant to leave the sky, the tide out far enough to expose a wide stretch of firm, damp sand, and the esplanade above dotted with people out for an evening stroll, dogs, prams, couples arm in arm enjoying the last of the day's warmth. It's the kind of evening where nothing unusual is supposed to happen. And for a long while, on this particular evening, nothing does. A little after 7 o'clock, a Christchurch businessman named Thomas Yeoman is walking the esplanade with his wife when they notice a man sitting below them on the sand, his back against the seawall, legs stretched out in front of him, dressed, a little incongruously for the beach, in a full suit. His head is tilted at an angle that looks distinctly uncomfortable, the kind of position you'd only hold if you'd simply dropped where you stood rather than settled in deliberately. As Thomas and his wife pass by, the man's right arm lifts a few inches off the sand, and then flops back down again. They don't think much of it. It's a warm evening. People have a drink or 2 on the beach and doze off all the time. Thomas and his wife exchange a glance, assume he simply had one too many, and carry on with their walk. They aren't the only 2 people to notice him that evening. A young couple further along the esplanade, sitting on a bench, spot him too, legs visible on the sand below, upper body obscured by the staircase leading down to the beach. And near the top of those same stairs, standing quite still, is another man. Watching. He never speaks to anyone. Nobody gets a good look at his face. He is never seen again, and to this day, nobody knows who he was, or whether he had anything at all to do with what happened next. At around 6 the following morning, 2 exercise riders take their horses down onto the beach for a morning gallop, the sand still cool and undisturbed from the overnight tide. They pass the same man, still sitting in the same spot against the seawall, and like Thomas Yeoman the evening before, assume he's simply sleeping off a heavy night. It's only on their way back along the beach, when they realize he hasn't moved even slightly in the time they've been gone, that something starts to feel wrong. They stop. They approach. And they find that he's dead. Waiting for someone to claim him. In the first days after the body was found, the general assumption among police was a simple, unremarkable one, that this was a natural death and that sooner or later, a wife or a brother or a landlady would come forward, mildly embarrassed, to explain that their husband, their brother, their tenant had gone out for an evening walk and never come home. The Christchurch newspapers ran a small item about an unidentified man found deceased on Sumner Beach, alongside a police request for anyone who recognized him to come forward. And people did come forward, dozens of them, in fact, in the weeks that followed. Worried families combing through missing persons notices, hoping against hope, arrived at the mortuary to view the body, each one convinced, at least for the length of the drive there, that they might finally be about to find a missing father, a missing son, a missing husband who had simply vanished one day, without explanation. Every single one of them left without an answer. The dead man matched no one's description closely enough to be confirmed, and one by one, Families who had allowed themselves a flicker of hope walked back out into the Christchurch afternoon with that hope extinguished all over again. It's a detail that's easy to skip past in a story like this one, but I don't think we should skip past it too quickly. For a little while, this nameless man on a beach represented dozens of different possible endings to dozens of different families' worst fears. And for every single one of them, in turn, it wasn't him, which meant whoever their own missing person was, they were still out there somewhere, unaccounted for, the mystery no closer to being solved. Part 2. Nothing out of place. As it happens, Thomas Yeoman is back at the beach that very morning, taking an early swim before work, when he notices the small, uneasy crowd forming further down the sand. He recognizes the man immediately, the same figure from the evening before, and rushes over. He's the one who calls the police. Constable David Prentice arrives a little before 7, and what he finds is, in its own way, more unsettling than a violent crime scene would have been. There's nothing out of place at all. No wounds, no bruising, no signs of any struggle. The sand around the body is undisturbed, as though nobody had approached him and he hadn't moved. His suit isn't torn or rumpled. A half-smoked cigarette has fallen from his mouth onto his collar at some point, but there's no burn mark on his skin or his clothing, which tells the constable that whatever ended this man's life, it happened quickly enough that he never even registered a lit cigarette falling against his own throat. His pockets, when searched, offer up a small, curious collection of objects. An unused bus ticket, an unused train ticket, 2 combs, 1 plastic, entirely ordinary, and 1 aluminium, of a type that, as it turns out, isn't sold anywhere in New Zealand at the time, believed, tentatively, to be American. A packet of chewing gum, a box of matches, and a packet of cigarettes that presents its own small, nagging puzzle. The box itself bears one brand's name, but the cigarettes inside are a different, noticeably more expensive brand entirely. It's worth lingering on that ticket for just a second because it tells its own small story. A man who buys a train ticket and a bus ticket and uses neither of them has usually changed his plans somewhere along the way, decided a different route made more sense, or been persuaded out of his original plan entirely by something or someone he encountered along the journey. 2 unused tickets, tucked into the pocket of a man who then simply sat down on a beach and never got up again. It's the kind of detail that means nothing on its own, and yet, taken together with everything else, seems to want to mean something. Now, at the time, it wasn't unusual for people to keep an expensive cigarette box and quietly refill it with cheaper smokes, a little bit of appearance management. Nothing more. But this man had done the exact opposite. Cheap box. Expensive cigarettes inside. Someone trying to look like they had less than they did. Or, perhaps, someone who simply hadn't thought about how any of it would look at all, because appearances were the very last thing on his mind. There's no wallet anywhere on him. No identification whatsoever. And here's the detail that turns this from a sad, ordinary tragedy into something else entirely. Every single label has been removed from his clothing. Not torn out carelessly, the way you might expect from someone in a hurry, but cut away, carefully, precisely, deliberately. Somebody didn't want this man identified. Or, and this thought will nag at investigators for decades to come, this man didn't want to be identified himself. Constable Prentice, in his initial notes, described the scene as unervingly tidy. Even the sand immediately around the body seemed almost deliberately undisturbed, as though whatever had happened here had happened quietly, without struggle, without panic, a description that would go on to unsettle nearly everyone who read the case file in the decades that followed. Violent deaths leave a mess. Accidents leave confusion. What Constable Prentice found instead looked, in his own words, like a man who had simply been placed there and had decided not to argue about it. Part 3. What the autopsy found. The body is taken to Christchurch Hospital, where a doctor places the time of death sometime after midnight, though with the tools available in 1957, pinning it down any more precisely than that simply isn't possible. An autopsy the following day paints a strange, almost contradictory picture. This was a well-built man, mid-40s, roughly 80 kilograms, with the kind of athletic physique that speaks to years of serious physical conditioning. And yet his hands are smooth, uncalloused. Nothing about them suggests a life of manual labor. His fingernails are neatly, carefully trimmed. He's missing more than a dozen teeth, unremarkable for the era, but his calf muscles are unusually well developed enough that the examining pathologist wonders aloud, almost to himself, whether this man might have been a dancer in an earlier life. And then there's a spleen, nearly 3 times its normal size. The kind of finding that speaks to serious, sustained illness, not to a man who simply collapsed peacefully on a beach overnight. For a short while, it looks as though this might simply be a tragic story about a very sick man who quietly passed away in a place he loved. Right up until the pathologist notices that his stomach, his liver, and his kidneys are all engorged with congealed blood, a pattern that, in 1957 medicine, points far more strongly toward poisoning than toward any natural process. Tissue samples are sent away for testing. Everyone expects them to come back confirming poison. Instead, they come back clean. Dr. Warwick Cole, the chemist who ran the tests, put it about as honestly as a scientist can at the eventual inquest. If he did die of poison, he said, it was something rare enough that our tests simply weren't built to catch it. That doesn't prove there wasn't one. It only proves we couldn't find it. To this day, nobody can say for certain what killed the man on Sumner Beach. Only that it almost certainly wasn't natural. And almost certainly wasn't an accident either. The plaster cast. Because the case remained unsolved for so long, and because the body itself could not be preserved indefinitely, investigators made a decision in early 1958 that would turn out to be one of the most important choices anyone made in this entire 60-year story, though nobody realized it at the time. They commissioned a plaster cast of the dead man's head and upper torso, a fairly standard practice for the era, used to help with identification when no usable photograph existed, and to give investigators something physical to work from long after the body itself had been buried. A local sculptor was engaged for the work, taking painstaking care to capture every feature as accurately as possible: the set of the jaw, the shape of the brow, even a few days' growth of stubble that had been carefully noted before the casting began. That plaster cast survived, tucked away in storage for well over 60 years, through changes of government, changes of policing technology, changes in what science was even capable of. Nobody involved in its creation in 1958 could possibly have imagined that the fine strands of hair caught in the plaster during the casting process would, more than 6 decades later, become the single piece of evidence that finally cracked the entire case open. Sometimes the most important piece of evidence in a story isn't the dramatic one. It's the quiet one, sitting in a storeroom, waiting patiently for the rest of the world to catch up to it. Part 4. A suitcase in the cloakroom. With no name and no obvious cause of death, detectives had almost nothing solid to work from, just a body, beautifully, deliberately unidentifiable, and a city full of people who had absolutely no idea who he was. Word went out to Christchurch's Central Railway Station, and staff there searched through the unclaimed luggage room. Sure enough, they turned up a brown suitcase, checked in the previous afternoon, and never collected. The claim ticket itself wasn't among the dead man's possessions, but a loose thread pulled from the suitcase's lining matched a repair stitched into the suit he'd been wearing, and detectives felt confident enough to call it his. Inside was the kind of kit any traveler might pack: a dressing gown, singlets, a razor and shaving brush, some plain stationery, trousers, a sports coat, alongside two much stranger inclusions, a stencil brush and a small screwdriver. Odd tools for a man who, by every outward appearance, was nothing like a tradesman. And just like his clothing, nearly every identifying label on every item in that suitcase had been carefully removed. Only a small handful survived, a laundry tag reading T. Marlowe, stitched into a singlet, and the same name on one necktie. Detectives ran down every T. Marlowe they could find anywhere in the country. Not one of them matched. It seemed just as likely in the end that the name belonged to whoever had owned these clothes before this particular man did. Second-hand clothing was common enough in the post-war years that this was hardly a stretch. And there was something almost logical about it when you thought it through. If you were determined to hide your own identity, the smart thing to do would be to leave behind a name that wasn't actually yours at all. It's worth pausing on that logic for a second because it says something quietly chilling about the mind of whoever removed those labels. This wasn't a panicked, last-minute cover-up. This was careful, considered. Someone sat down, at some point, and thought through exactly what a stranger going through these clothes afterward might learn from them, and then methodically closed off every single avenue except one small, deliberately misleading thread. That's not the behavior of someone acting on impulse. That's the behavior of someone who had been planning this, in some form, for quite some time. Detectives held onto the suitcase and its contents for years, cataloging and recataloguing every item as new leads emerged and went nowhere. Sadly, in a decision that investigators today still shake their heads over, the physical suitcase and everything in it was eventually destroyed during a routine evidence clear-out decades later, long before anyone imagined that modern forensic science might one day want another look at it. All that survives now are the original photographs and written inventories, a frustrating gap in a case that has already given up its secrets so reluctantly. Detectives dug further and found that the dead man's jacket had been manufactured in the United States. So had the fabric of his tie. None of that proved he was American himself. It did prove, at minimum, that either he or his clothes had traveled a very long way to end up on a beach in Christchurch. At the time, detectives also floated a far more mundane explanation for the missing labels, one that's easy to forget, decades on, when the mystery has taken on such a mythic quality. Post-war clothing rationing had made second-hand garments enormously common, and it wasn't unheard of for tailors or previous owners to remove labels for entirely unremarkable reasons: resizing, reselling, simple wear, and tear. The trouble was the sheer completeness of it. One or two missing labels might be nothing at all. Every single label on every single item, removed with obvious care and precision, that started to look like something else entirely, a pattern, rather than a coincidence. And patterns, in a case with this little else to go on, tend to take on outsized importance very quickly.
Part 5.
Tempus fugit. Months passed. The case went cold. With no identification forthcoming despite public appeals, the unnamed man was eventually buried in a Christchurch cemetery beneath a simple stone. It reads, still today, "Here lies an unknown man, found at Sumner Beach, December 1957. It was around this time, well after the burial, frustratingly, that a piece of evidence surfaced that had somehow been missed in the initial search. A small pocket, carefully stitched inside the waistband of the dead man's trousers, so subtle it had escaped notice entirely during the first examination. Inside it, a tightly folded scrap of paper. Printed on it, in neat type, were two words, Latin words, tempus fugit, time flees. It took some digging, but a printer eventually matched the type to the final page of an obscure, largely forgotten little book of poetry called The Wanderer's Rest. Verses about mortality, about memory, about time slipping through your fingers no matter how tightly you try to hold on. Investigators put out a public appeal. Had anyone, anywhere in the country, ever owned a copy of this exact, rather rare book, with a piece missing from its very last page? Weeks later, remarkably, a man came forward. He said he'd discovered a copy of The Wanderer's Rest sitting on the back seat of his own car, a car he'd left parked, unlocked, near Sumner Beach on the very night the dead man was found. It wasn't his book. He swore he'd never laid eyes on it before and had absolutely no explanation for how it might have ended up there. Paper experts confirmed it beyond doubt. The torn scrap from the dead man's secret pocket had come from that exact copy of that exact book, which raises a question that has never really gone away. Why leave a book like that in a stranger's unlocked car, of all places, rather than simply throwing it in a bin somewhere? Was he trying to dispose of it in a hurry? Was he hoping, somehow, that somebody specific would eventually find it? And then there's the detail that turned this from a strange mystery into something closer to a genuine puzzle. On the inside back cover of that same copy, in handwriting nobody has ever definitively identified, were 5 short lines of jumbled capital letters. A code, some believed, a cipher, others insisted, of genuine and deliberate complexity. Military cryptographers were brought in over the years. Every single one of them came away empty-handed. To this day, nobody knows for certain whether it's a code at all. It might just as easily be a private shorthand, a memory aid for favorite lines of poetry that meant something only to the man who wrote them, never intended for anyone else's eyes at all. When police released the code publicly, hoping a fresh set of eyes somewhere in the country might crack what their own experts couldn't, they got considerably more than they bargained for. Letters poured in for years afterward, some from genuinely credentialed cryptographers offering careful, technical analysis, and a great many more from amateur enthusiasts absolutely convinced they'd cracked it over a cup of tea on a Sunday afternoon. One correspondent was certain the letters spelled out coordinates to a hidden fortune. Another was equally certain they were a confession, if only read backwards and every third letter skipped. A retired mathematics teacher from Timaru wrote in almost annually for the better part of 2 decades, each time with a new theory, each time convinced this was finally the one. None of them were ever confirmed. And in a strange way, that's part of why this case has held people's attention for as long as it has. An unsolved code is an invitation. It asks you to lean in a little closer, to believe that you, personally, might be the one who finally sees what everyone else missed. Nobody ever has. But that hasn't stopped generations of amateur codebreakers from trying.
Part 6.
Elaine Wickham. Beneath that strange, unsolved code, in smaller handwriting, were 2 telephone numbers. One traced to a local bank, a dead end. The other traced to a young nurse named Elaine Wickham, who, and this is the detail that changed everything about how investigators viewed the case, lived barely 400 meters from the exact spot where the dead man had been found. Suddenly, Sumner Beach didn't look like a random destination anymore. It looked like somewhere he'd meant to go. When detectives knocked on Elaine's door, she denied, flatly and immediately, ever having heard of the dead man. But the moment they mentioned the Wanderer's Rest by name, something in her composure slipped.
Just slightly.
Just enough for a trained investigator to notice. "That's one of my favorite books," she admitted. She told them she'd owned a copy once, years earlier, and had given it away as a gift to a young serviceman she'd met while training as a nurse during the war. For a moment, detectives believed they finally had their answer. They tracked the serviceman down. He was alive, well, and still had his original copy of the book sitting on a shelf in his own home, inscription and all, completely intact. Whoever the dead man was, he'd been carrying an entirely different copy of the very same book. One that, somehow, also had Elaine Whitcomb's telephone number written inside the back cover. When investigators showed her the plaster cast that had been made of the dead man's face and upper body, a common practice at the time, used to help with identification when no photograph exists, Elaine could barely bring herself to look at it. She gave short, clipped, single-word answers to nearly every question that followed. More than one detective who interviewed her that day came away with the same distinct impression that this was a woman who knew considerably more than she was prepared to say out loud. One detective's notes from that interview, preserved in the case file for decades afterward, record part of the exchange almost word for word. "Do you recognize this man?"
No.
"You're quite sure?" A pause, according to the notes, long enough that the detective thought it worth writing down. "I told you."
No.
"Miss Wickham, your telephone number was written by hand inside a book found on his person. A book you've just told us is your favorite. That's a significant coincidence." Another pause. "I can't explain that. I don't know this man. I'm sorry I can't be more help to you." She was, the detective noted afterward, polite throughout the entire interview.
Calm.
Cooperative in every way except the one that actually mattered. And utterly, immovably unwilling to say anything beyond what she'd already said. She asked and was granted anonymity. For decades, she was known publicly only as the nurse, her real name protected at her own request. She went on to raise 2 children largely on her own, and in the small, tight-knit community around Sumner, quiet speculation about their father's identity would occasionally resurface for years afterward, whenever the case made the news.
Part 7.
Spies, Ghosts, and Strangers. With no confirmed identity and no confirmed cause of death, the case did what unsolved mysteries always seem to do eventually. It filled the silence with theories. Some believed the man had been some kind of foreign intelligence operative drawn to the wider Christchurch area, so the theory went by a hush-hush joint research program rumored to be operating not far from the city in that era, the sort of Cold War secrecy that made almost any strange detail sound plausible if you squinted at it the right way. The carefully removed labels. The untraceable poison. The unsolved code hidden in a book of poetry. It's an easy story to tell if you want to tell it.
Spies.
Secret messages. A silencing. The spy theory, in particular, took on a life of its own over the decades. Enthusiasts pointed to the era itself as much as to any specific piece of evidence. The early years of the Cold War, a time when intelligence services on both sides of the Iron Curtain were known to be active across the Pacific, cultivating contacts, monitoring shipping routes, occasionally losing agents to accidents, defections, or worse, in ways that rarely if ever made it into any official record. A man with no identifiable past, carrying an obscure book with what looked like a coded message inside it, found dead by means that resisted every test available at the time. It isn't hard to see why that particular story took hold of people's imaginations and never entirely let go. True crime enthusiasts have built entire online forums around the theory, poring over the geography of where the body was found relative to shipping lanes and research facilities, hunting for a connection that, so far, nobody has ever definitively proven. Others believed something far less dramatic, and in its own way, far sadder. That this was simply a man among the thousands of displaced people who arrived in New Zealand in the uneasy years following the Second World War. Someone who had, out of necessity or grief or something else entirely, built himself a new identity and carried the truth of his old one to an unmarked grave. And then there were those, a great many over the decades, who believed, quite simply, that Elaine Whitcomb knew exactly who this man was and had chosen, for reasons that were entirely her own, to carry that secret with her for the rest of her life. For more than 60 years, absolutely nobody could prove which of these stories, if any, was true. Every decade or so, the case would resurface, a newspaper anniversary feature, a radio documentary, a university researcher poking around in old files for a thesis, and each time, the same theories would be dusted off, argued over in letters to the editor, and eventually set back down again, no closer to resolved than before. Elaine Whitcomb, on the rare occasions journalists managed to track her down over the decades, always declined to say anything further than she'd told police at the very beginning. More than one reporter noted that she had an uncanny habit of being away visiting family whenever the story found its way back into the news, only to reappear, entirely coincidentally, once the interest had died back down again. Part 8. A retired teacher who wouldn't let go. Every unsolved mystery needs somebody who simply refuses to leave it alone, and for the man on Sumner Beach, that person was a retired schoolteacher from Dunedin named Grant Pillins. Grant stumbled across the case in the early 2000s, in the way people often stumble across the mysteries that go on to consume the rest of their lives: an old newspaper clipping, a chance conversation, a rabbit hole he fully intended to climb back out of within a week or two. Instead, he spent nearly 2 decades chasing it, corresponding with genealogists, historians, forensic specialists, and, every so often, deeply unhelpful government departments, in the hope of finally putting a name to the man in the grave. His breakthrough, when it finally came, wasn't some dramatic piece of detective work. It was patience, paperwork, and modern science finally catching up to a 60-year-old mystery. In 2019, after years of petitioning, Grant successfully secured permission to have the remains exhumed. Using strands of hair carefully preserved from the original 1958 plaster cast, a resource nobody in 1957 could possibly have imagined would one day crack the case wide open, geneticists were finally able to construct a usable DNA profile. From there, it became a different kind of investigation entirely. Researchers compared that DNA profile against public genealogy databases, tracing distant cousins, second cousins, third cousins twice removed, painstakingly reconstructing an entire family tree branch by branch, hoping it would eventually lead back to a single, specific person. In 2022, after nearly 3 more years of work, it finally did. Grant Pillins has said, in the handful of interviews he's given since, that he never once seriously considered giving up, even in the long stretches, sometimes entire years, where the research seemed to be leading nowhere at all. People used to ask me why I cared so much about a dead stranger from before I was even born, he said. And I never had a brilliant answer for that. I think it's just that somebody has to. Somebody has to be the person who doesn't let a human being stay a mystery forever, if there's any way at all to stop that from happening. It felt like the least I could do for him, whoever he turned out to be. He has also spoken candidly about the 2 formal requests to exhume the remains that were rejected before the third, successful one in 2019. Years of paperwork, submissions, and patient, polite persistence with authorities who, quite reasonably, needed to weigh the disturbance of a grave against the uncertain odds of it actually solving anything. I understood their caution, Grant has said. I just happened to disagree with where they drew the line. And I was willing to keep asking until somebody agreed with me instead. Part 9. Albert Reeve. The man who died on Sumner Beach in December 1957 was named Albert Reeve. Born in 1911 in the small Otago town of Milton, the son of a boilermaker. And here is where the story takes its final, genuinely astonishing turn. Official naval records had listed Albert Reeve as lost at sea in 1943, one of thousands of merchant sailors who never made it home after their ship was torpedoed in the Atlantic during the war. His family grieved him. They held a small memorial service in Milton with an empty coffin. They moved on with their lives, the way grieving families do, believing there was nothing more to know, nothing more to wonder about. Except Albert Reeve hadn't died in 1943 at all. He'd been pulled from the water, alive, by a passing vessel, treated for his injuries overseas, And for reasons that will very likely never be fully understood, reasons that died with him on that beach, he never once contacted his family again. He built an entirely new, quiet life for himself somewhere far from home, under circumstances nobody has ever been able to fully reconstruct for well over a decade. Then, in the winter of 1957, unannounced, and by then almost completely unrecognizable, Albert Reeve came back to New Zealand. What happened to Albert Reeve in those 14 missing years remains, even now, largely a matter of educated guesswork. Shipping records from the port where he was reportedly picked up after the sinking show a man matching his rough description, signing on with a merchant vessel under a different name only months later, whether out of trauma, shame, a desire to simply disappear, or something else entirely. Nobody can say. Fragments of correspondence uncovered by researchers suggest he spent time in at least 2 other countries before eventually working his way back across the Pacific. He never married, as far as anyone has been able to establish. He never settled anywhere for long. It's tempting, telling a story like this one, to fill in those blank years with something dramatic, a love affair, a criminal past, a secret so terrible it justified never going home. The honest answer is that we simply don't know. Sometimes a person just walks away from their own life, and the reasons why die along with them. Descendants of his family, eventually tracked down through Grant Pillins's genealogical research, had never heard his name spoken as anything other than a name on an old memorial plaque in a small-town cemetery. Not one of them had the faintest idea he might have quietly lived on for more than 14 years after the Navy had officially given him up for dead. And Elaine Whitcomb? Genealogists were finally able to confirm what a good many people in the Sumner community had quietly suspected for over half a century. She and Albert Reeve had known each other before the war, during the years she trained as a young nurse. Whether he traveled all the way to Christchurch specifically to find her again, hoping, perhaps, to reclaim some piece of the life he'd once had, or for some entirely different reason connected to the lost years nobody can account for, remains even now genuinely unknown. Elaine passed away in the 1990s. She never told her children the full story. 2 families, 1 phone call. When Grant Pillins finally confirmed the identification in 2022, 2 very different families received the news in 2 very different ways. For the Reeve family in Otago, it meant sitting down, nearly 80 years after the fact, to absorb the news that a man they had mourned as a young sailor lost at sea had, in reality, lived on quietly for another 14 years before dying, alone and unidentified, on a beach several hundred kilometers from anyone who loved him. One of Albert's elderly grandnephews, contacted by researchers, described the feeling as something like grieving a person twice, once as a young man lost to the war and now, all over again, as someone who might have simply come home, and never did. "We had a plaque with his name on it in the local cemetery for 70-odd years," he said. "Turns out he wasn't under it. It's a strange thing, visiting a grave for a man who wasn't there the whole time." For Elaine Whitcomb's descendants, the news landed rather differently. Less a revelation about a stranger, and more a long overdue answer to a question that had quietly shadowed their family for 3 generations. Elaine's granddaughter, reached by a journalist covering the identification, said the family had always suspected there was more to the story than her grandmother had ever let on. "She'd go very quiet whenever it came up," she said. "Not upset exactly. Just somewhere else, in her head, for a minute. We used to joke that Nana had a whole secret life we didn't know about. Turns out we weren't entirely wrong. I just wish she'd felt like she could have told us before she went. I don't think any of us would have judged her for it." The strange code hidden in the back of that little book of poetry has never been solved. The official cause of death remains, on paper, undetermined to this day. But after more than 60 years of an unmarked grave and an unanswered question, The man on Sumner Beach finally had his name back. This has been The Man Nobody Claimed, a work of fiction inspired loosely by the strange, patient mysteries that occasionally wash up in the true crime and historical true mystery world, but with every name, every place, and every specific detail reimagined for tonight's telling. And that's tonight's story here on Emovura Audiobooks. If tonight's story kept you company, please think about subscribing to the channel. Until next time, this has been Emovura Audiobooks. Rest well, stay curious, and we'll see you in the next story.